I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are a police detective.
Okay.
And the year is 1983. You get called out to a local peat bog in Cheshire, England. Commercial workers there have just unearthed something absolutely horrifying on their conveyor belt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a human head. And, like, we're not talking about some bleached, dusty, historical-looking skull here.
Right.
This head still has hair attached. It has soft tissue. It even has a left eyeball perfectly intact.
Which is just, I mean, that's nightmare fuel right there.
Exactly. So obviously you immediately launch a murder investigation, and almost instantly, a local man whose property borders the bog, he just breaks down. He confesses to killing his wife 2 decades earlier. Case closed, right? Like,
Right.
wrap it up, send it to the prosecutor.
Yeah, it seems like the most open and shut case in detective history.
Yeah.
You have the victim's physical remains, and then you have this detailed, tearful confession from the killer.
Leading you right to the supposed burial site?
Right. Like, it doesn't get easier than that.
Well, wrong. Because this case is about to take a turn so bizarre, it completely shatters the fundamental assumption of the entire investigation, which is, the timeline.
Yeah, the timeline it's everything here.
It really is. So today we are going on a deep dive into the bizarre and truly fascinating world of the Lindow bog bodies. To figure out how this all happened, we're pulling from this wild mix of sources today.
It's a great stack.
We've got original police records, forensic archaeology papers, and even a Gresham College lecture that completely upends how we view ancient history.
It's just an incredible cross-section of materials. We're putting modern criminal psychology side by side with ancient Roman history.
Yeah.
And like some intensely complex chemical analyses just to see how they all collide in a patch of English mud.
So the mission for today, we are going to unpack how a 1,600-year-old corpse accidentally solved a modern missing persons case.
Still blows my mind.
We'll explore the strange, almost alien chemistry of peat bogs that freeze time. And ultimately, we're going to see why everything we think we know about ancient history might just be, well, a story we're projecting onto the past. Okay, let's unpack this. Take us back to that day in May 1983.
Right, so it's May 13th. 2 commercial peat cutters, Andy Mould and Stephen Dooley, they're working at Lindow Man.
Just a normal workday.
Exactly. They're overseeing this heavy machinery that processes and mills dried peat for fuel. And suddenly, Mould spots something unusual just tumbling along the conveyor belt.
What did it look like?
It was covered in dark dirt, roughly the size and shape of a football.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so they pull it off, they clean it up, and realize to their absolute horror that it's a partially preserved human head.
And you mentioned the preservation before, but it's not just the surface, right?
No, the preservation isn't just surface level at all. Brain matter is actually still preserved inside the skull.
Ugh.
And yeah, the optic nerve of that left eyeball is clearly visible.
Which naturally triggers absolute panic at the local police station.
Oh, completely.
And for good reason, because this bog is practically in the backyard of a man named Peter Rainbart. Now, Rainbart, he had been under a cloud of local suspicion for over 20 years.
Right, because of his wife.
Exactly. Back in 1961, his wife, Malika de Fernandez, mysteriously vanished. And he always claimed she just left him to travel, but, rumors had swirled for decades.
Small towns, yeah.
Yeah. So the police knock on his door and tell him, point blank, they've found a woman's head in the bog at the edge of his property.
And Rainbart's psychological reaction is immediate. I mean, he assumes the game is up.
He just folds.
He does. He looks at the detectives and literally says, "It has been so long I thought I would never be found out."
Wow.
And then he proceeds to give a full, unprompted confession. He details strangling his wife during a violent argument, dismembering her body with an axe, and trying to hide the remains in a drainage ditch near the edge of the bog.
It's like a real-life Edgar Allan Poe story. It's the telltale heart, except, like, the wrong heart starts beating.
A wrong heart, exactly.
The guilt just bubbles right up to the surface because he thinks the earth has literally given up his secrets. But here is the massive twist. Detective George Abbott, who was leading the case, he was a really meticulous investigator.
A good cop.
Yeah, he realizes they haven't found the rest of the body. So he sends this incredibly well-preserved skull down to Oxford University for radiocarbon dating, just to cross his T's and dot his I's.
Just to be absolutely sure they have the remains of Malika de Fernandez.
Right.
And then the results from Oxford drop an absolute bomb on the entire investigation.
I love this part.
The radiocarbon dating reveals that the skull did not belong to a woman killed in 1961. It dated back to approximately 250 AD.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. This was a 1,600-year-old ancient Roman-era woman.
It is almost comical. Rainbark confessed to a murder because he was confronted with the physical remains of an ancient historical artifact.
A museum piece, basically.
Yes. And of course, upon hearing the news, he immediately tried to walk it all back. Like he tried to withdraw his confession.
Natural.
He tried to get the charge downgraded, claiming he only shook her and didn't actually mean to kill her.
But the legal system didn't let him off the hook, even though the prosecution had no physical body, because again, the head on the table was a Roman artifact. His initial confession was just incredibly detailed.
Right, he gave up too much info.
Exactly. It included highly specific information about the dismemberment and the layout of his property. The prosecutor argued convincingly that local wildlife had likely carried off Malika's actual remains decades ago.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. And after just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of murder by a vote of 11-1.
So he spent the rest of his life in prison. This ancient woman, dubbed the Lindow Woman, accidentally solved a 20-year-old modern cold case from beyond the grave.
That's incredible.
But wait, this brings up a huge glaring question for you and me, and I think for anyone listening. If I am a police detective and I look at a head that is 1,600 years old, it should look like a skull.
Right, bud.
It should look like a dusty museum exhibit. How on earth did a head from 250 AD look fresh enough with hair and an eyeball to convince a guilty husband and a highly trained team of detectives that it was a modern murder victim?
Well, that is the magic and, frankly, the scientific terror of the peat bog. The chemistry of a bog is highly specific and completely hostile to the normal, natural processes of biological decay.
Hostile how?
So, for a bog body to be preserved like this, you need a very specific ecosystem, specifically a sphagnum moss bog. First, the temperature at the time the body enters the bog must be exceptionally cold, usually lower than 4 degrees Celsius.
Okay, pretty freezing.
And the annual average temperature of the water has to stay below 10 degrees.
So it operates essentially as a natural geological refrigerator.
A refrigerator filled with a highly reactive chemical soup. Right. Sphagnum moss actively alters the water around it. As the moss dies, it forms these dense sediment layers and releases humic acids and complex sugars that aggressively consume oxygen.
Okay.
Because the surface of the water is choked with a thick mat of living moss, the environment below becomes completely anaerobic. There is zero oxygen down there.
And without oxygen, the aerobic bacteria and microorganisms that normally break down soft tissue and, cause putrefaction, they simply cannot survive. They suffocate.
Precisely. But the moss goes one step further, and this is the crucial mechanism. The moss releases chemical compounds called tannins.
Like in wine.
Same word, yeah.
Yeah.
If you've ever wondered how a raw animal hide becomes a tough, durable leather jacket, it's a chemical reaction. Tannins literally bind to the collagen proteins in the human tissue.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they cross-link the protein chains, knitting them together so tightly that the tissue becomes an impenetrable barrier. So rather than rotting, the human skin, the internal organs, the brain matter, and the hair are literally tanned into waterproof leather.
That is wild.
And interestingly, the extreme acidity that preserves that soft tissue often leaches the calcium right out of the bones, dissolving them over time.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It's the exact opposite of a normal dirt burial, where the flesh rots away and the hard skeleton remains.
Okay, I have to push back here.
Go for it.
If the bog is essentially this highly reactive chemical vat that drastically alters organic matter, literally replacing the moisture with tannins, cross-linking proteins, turning skin to leather, doesn't that make dating the remains incredibly difficult?
Oh, absolutely.
Because to understand this, we have to look at how radiocarbon dating actually works. As living things, we constantly absorb carbon-14 from our environment. When we die, we stop absorbing it.
Yeah.
And that carbon-14 slowly decays into nitrogen at a predictable rate.
Right, the carbon clock.
Scientists measure what's left to build a timeline. But how can we trust that delicate chemical clock in a body that has been marinating in acid and moss for a millennium?
You're hitting on the exact nightmare that forensic archaeologists face. The very environment that preserves the body completely wrecks the chemical clock. Environmental contamination heavily skews radiocarbon dating.
It has to, right?
It does. The academic sources we have specifically highlight how incredibly fragile our grasp of time is when relying on these tests. The most famous example of this chaos, which the researchers cite, is actually the Shroud of Turin.
Right, the ancient linen cloth believed by many to be the burial shroud of Jesus.
Yeah. In 1988, 3 independent laboratories carbon dated the shroud and concluded it was medieval, dating between 1260 and 1390 AD. But the scientific controversy that followed is directly relevant to our bog bodies.
How so?
Scientists pointed out that the shroud had survived a massive church fire in Chambéry, France in 1532.
Wait, so smoke from a fire physically injected newer carbon into a centuries-old cloth?
That is the leading theory among critics of the 1988 dating. Researchers argued that an isotopic exchange occurred between the linen and the carbon monoxide gases generated during the fire.
It's crazy.
The extreme heat forced the older carbon isotopes out and forced newer, freshly burned carbon isotopes in, artificially rejuvenating the clock's date by centuries.
Wow.
Furthermore, microbiologists later discovered that the shroud's fibers were coated with a bioplastic layer of bacteria and fungi that conventional cleaning methods simply couldn't remove.
Just living on the cloth.
Yeah, and one scientist noted that this invisible microbial coating alone could skew the dating by 500 to 600 years. We see similar contamination issues in Egyptology.
Like the famous mummy 1770 at the Manchester Museum.
Exactly.
When they ran the carbon dating on that mummy, the bones were originally dated 800 to 1,000 years older than the bandages wrapping them.
Which physically makes no sense.
Right. The researchers eventually realized that the specific resins, oils, and unguents used in the mummification process had deeply contaminated the linen, completely resetting its chemical clock.
It's a stark reminder that a timestamp from a lab isn't some flawless, magical window into the past. It's a data point, and it can easily be skewed by the very earth, fire, or resins that preserved the artifact in the first place.
But this chaotic radiocarbon dating of the Lindow woman wasn't just a one-off fluke. It was actually a warning sign.
Oh, yeah.
Because the very next year, this exact same bog was about to spit out an even bigger mystery, one that would force archaeologists to question not just a timeline, but an entire culture.
Fast forward exactly 1 year to August 1984. Our same peat cutter, Andy Mold, who at this point must be absolutely terrified of his own conveyor belt.
Right, like, not again.
He spots what looks like a large piece of dark wood or bark. He brushes the dirt away and sees a human toenail.
Good grief.
He immediately stops the machine, calls the police, and this time, knowing what's in the bog, they bring in an archaeologist named Rick Turner.
And what they excavate is breathtaking. It's a second body, which becomes known as Lindow Man, or Lindow II. He is the first fully intact bog body ever found in the United Kingdom. He's estimated to be around 1,900 years old, placing him right around the chaotic era of the Roman occupation of Britain.
And he was found wearing absolutely nothing except a fox fur armband.
Just an armband.
And just like Lindow Woman, the preservation is staggering. I mean, he still has his manicured fingernails, his hair, his beard, but it's his autopsy that completely changes the landscape of British archaeology.
They brought in a clinical pathologist, right?
Yes, Ian West, to do a full forensic workup. And the findings were incredibly violent.
West concluded that Lindow Man was the victim of what archaeologists call an overkill, or a triple death. First, his skull was fractured by 2 massive blows from a blunt object, likely an axe handle.
Brutal.
Second, there was a twisted animal sinew cord tied tightly around his neck, acting as a garrote, which broke his neck. Finally, his jugular vein was cleanly slit with a sharp blade.
A triple death. That doesn't sound like a robbery gone wrong. It sounds highly ritualistic, and this is where the cultural narrative completely exploded.
Tell me about the Druids.
Right, so Professor Melanie Giles from the University of Manchester looked at this violent overkill, the naked body, the carefully placed fox fur armband, and theorized this was a highly choreographed blood sacrifice.
And she grounds this in the intense historical context of the era. This was the Iron Age transitioning violently into the Roman period. The Roman military occupation of Britain was brutal.
It was a nightmare.
Professor Giles suggests that Celtic Iron Age societies were exchange societies. They took valuable resources from the bog iron ore for weapons, peat for fuel, moss for medicine, and during a time of existential apocalyptic crisis like the Roman invasion, they may have felt the need to make the ultimate offering back to the gods of the bog.
A human life.
Offered in the most theatrical way possible.
What's fascinating here is how eagerly modern society ate this up. She even suggested he might have been a willing emissary, like an aristocratic volunteer stepping into the next world to appeal to the gods.
People love that.
We collectively embrace this dark, romantic, cinematic vision of ancient Britain. Savage, mystical druids conducting violent blood sacrifices in the swirling mist of the bog.
It's very cinematic.
It fits so perfectly with the mysterious, primitive aesthetic we want to project onto the ancient past.
It does fit perfectly. But as we've seen with the dating, a perfect story in archaeology is usually a red flag. Which brings us to the Gresham College lecture by Professor Ronald Hutton.
Yes, Hutton's lecture is brilliant.
Hutton's entire premise is that we need to be incredibly careful about the stories we tell ourselves about the past, especially when the physical evidence is ambiguous. Hutton throws a massive bucket of cold water on the whole Druid sacrifice certainty.
He points out a very inconvenient truth about our historical sources. Almost everything we know about Druids conducting human sacrifices comes from Roman writers.
Oh, right, the conquerors.
Exactly. Think about Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars. He's writing back to the Senate in Rome, trying to justify massive military expenditures and horrific casualties.
Right, he needs a good excuse.
If he says, "I'm slaughtering a sophisticated civilization," that's a tough sell. But if he says, "These people are savage Druids who burn human beings alive to appease dark gods," suddenly he's a civilizing hero bringing order to the barbaric fringe of the world.
It's PR.
It's totally PR. The Romans frequently used accusations of human sacrifice as political propaganda. They levied the exact same charges against early Christians and Jews. By painting the Celts as bloodthirsty savages, the Romans justified their own brutal military expansion.
So we might be looking at a 2,000-year-old smear campaign and taking it as absolute historical fact.
It's really likely.
But what about the physical evidence? The triple death autopsy. That gets pushed back on too. Professor Robert Connolly, an anatomy expert, did his own forensic analysis of Lindow Man, and his conclusions completely strip away the ritualistic mysticism.
They really do.
Connolly argued that the man wasn't ritually sacrificed. He was simply beaten to death, a rain of brutal blows that broke his skull and his ribs.
And this is where the forensic interpretation gets wild.
Wait, if Connolly thinks the man was just beaten in a mundane murder, how does he explain the garrote? You can't just accidentally tie a sinew cord tightly around your own neck.
The underlying mechanism here is the water itself. Connolly argued it wasn't a garrote at all.
What was it?
He believed it was just a simple decorative necklace. It only looked tight because the bog water had caused the soft tissues of the neck to dramatically swell over 1,900 years.
Oh my God.
Yeah. As the neck expanded, the necklace bit into the leathered skin, making the cord appear to be a deliberate weapon of strangulation.
That is incredible. The environment didn't just preserve the body, it actively reshaped the evidence. And what about the slit throat? The final dramatic piece of the blood sacrifice.
Connolly suggested the cut to the jugular occurred long after death.
Like when?
Possibly an accidental slice from a modern peat cutter spade during the 1984 excavation process itself.
Wow. So suddenly, our mystical, cinematic druid blood sacrifice turns into a tragic but very mundane ancient mugging whose corpse was accidentally mangled by a modern tractor. And if the cause of death is highly debatable, the date of death is even worse.
It was a textbook example of the carbon dating complexities we discussed earlier. 3 highly prestigious laboratories tested Lindow Man, and the results were a mess.
Tell me.
The Harwell Laboratory dated him to the 5th century AD well into the post-Roman period. The Oxford Laboratory dated him to the 1st century AD, the height of the Roman military occupation. And the British Museum dated him to the 3rd century BC deep in the pre-Roman Iron Age.
Let me get this straight. 3 of the most prestigious labs in the world looked at the exact same body. And you're telling me they couldn't agree on whether he died before the Romans even arrived, while they were building roads, or after the empire completely collapsed.
They missed the mark by 8 centuries.
It's like looking at a historical Rorschach test. We stared at a beaten, leathery body pulled out of the mud, and we saw exactly what we wanted to see.
Yep.
We saw a highly choreographed, mystical druid sacrifice, largely because that is the exciting story we wanted the past to tell us. We let the romantic narrative override the messy, contradictory science.
Which brings us back to Professor Hutton's central plea for a plurality of interpretation. When dealing with prehistoric or ancient remains, especially those pulled from the chemically chaotic environment of a bog, we have to accept that we cannot get inside the minds of the people who lived then.
We just can't.
We don't know their politics, their specific religious dogmas, or their daily fears. We have to get comfortable with ambiguity. We have to be okay with saying he might have been a willing sacrifice or he might have been murdered for his shoes.
And because we can't definitively know their minds, these bog bodies end up acting as mirrors for our own.
That's a great way to put it.
The Irish Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney captured this perfectly. He was profoundly moved by photographs of bog bodies, and he used them in his poetry collection North to write about the modern political violence during the Troubles in Ireland.
Right.
He used ancient bodies to process modern grief.
For Heaney, the bog bodies weren't just sterile archaeological curiosities.
Yeah.
They forced a direct, visceral, face-to-face encounter with human nature and our shared mortality.
Yeah.
They collapsed time, showing us that the human capacity for violence and the tragedy of death is a constant thread connecting the Iron Age to the 20th century.
So what does this all mean for you? We started this deep dive with a detective in 1983, looking down at a face in the mud, trying to solve a crime. And in a way, that is exactly what archaeologists are doing, just on a much longer timeline.
It really is.
But the Earth doesn't give up its secrets easily. It changes the chemistry, it alters the radiocarbon clock, and it forces us to confront our own biases about the stories we tell.
It reminds us that history isn't always a clean, linear narrative. It's often murky, ambiguous, and heavily shaped by the lens through which we view it.
As you go about your day, consider this. We look back at these leathery bodies and judge the ancient Romans and Celts for their brutality or their strange perceived rituals based on whatever we dig up. But think about our own modern landfills.
Well, that's interesting.
They are highly compressed, acidic, anaerobic environments, not entirely unlike a peat bog. If a landfill preserves our remains and our garbage perfectly for 2,000 years, what bizarre, completely inaccurate story will future archaeologists project onto us based on the random preserved trash we happen to be buried with?